Shavua Tov. I'd like to talk today about what strikes me as a general problem that arises in the writings of a lot of the Hebrew prophets, which is that there's something so excoriating about their critique of ancient Judaic or Israelite society that it becomes difficult to tell how to view our own present moment in light of what they teach. They're so harsh and they're so critical that it feels either like it doesn't apply today, or like if it always applies, then there's no hope of doing well or doing better. And I'll explain a little bit better what I mean by that. So maybe, you could start in a number of different places, but maybe the best place to start is the beginning of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, who is one of the greatest of the prophets and certainly is very much a critic of the Israelite society that he beholds. And as with many Nevi'im, with many prophets, the idea is basically that the Navi looks all around and sees all of this corruption and all of this cruelty and all of this exploitation of the weak, all this theft and all this violence, et cetera, and lists all of these sins and then says, if you're going to act this way, then your offerings to Hashem mean nothing. The temple is going to be destroyed because of your wickedness, and it doesn't matter however many sort of pans of incense you light, or the ritual has no purpose if you're not going to be righteous. And of course, it's a very important message, but it does raise the question: is that always the message? Is it the message today as much as it was then, or was it more the message then? And we have other issues today, because the language is so stark that we could have trouble making proper use of it in more than one way. So let's be explicit about what we mean by that. So here's a pasuk in, I think, the first chapter of Yeshayahu. Shim'u devar Adonai k'tzine Sodom ha'azinu Torat Eloheinu am amora. Hear the word of the Lord, the rulers of stone, give ear to the Torah of our God, people of Gomorrah. So he's starting off by saying to the Israelites, you're like Sodom and Amorah, which is this most wicked society in the Torah that is destroyed by Hashem, by a rain of fire from above. So it's really, underlying the point very sharply that this society, as it is currently, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not allow it to stand, will not allow it to continue to exist. It's so wicked, right? And he goes on to say, he's speaking for Hashem. What is the purpose of your sacrifices? There's no point in making sacrifices if you're going to be so wicked. And, just to get kind of explicit about what the accusations are, it's Uvefarishchem kapechem ha'elim עיניי מכם גם כי תרבו תפילה. אינני שומע ידיכם דמים מלאו. And when you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. And when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Like you are murderers, you're killers, you're wicked. So wicked, your hands are full of blood. And, it goes on. Echa haitha lezona kirya ne'emana mileti mishpat tzedek yalin ba'we'anta miratzhim. How the faithful city has become a harlot. It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it. But now miratzhim, murderers. Or saraich sordim v'havrei gnavim kulo. Ohev shohad, rodef, Shalmonim yatom lo yishpetu ve'riv almana lo yavo alehem. Your princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They judge not the orphans, neither does the cause of the widow reach them. Okay, so it's all just your society is corrupt. You are exploiting the weak and the vulnerable, who are archetypally the widow and the orphan. You're murderers, you're thieves. And one way that we could read this is from this remove in history. Thousands of years later, you could look back and say, wow, things got really bad back then. Just imagine what it must have been like. A society where everyone was just constantly nose to nose with the worst and most obvious kind of crime and just kind of trying to benefit from misdeeds in whatever way they could. And when you look at it that way, you could say, oh yeah, I understand very well why Hashem destroyed his temple and Jerusalem and scattered his people, because boy, they were the worst, right? But the problem with that is that there's both something a little bit implausible about it at the level of, but these people were the ones who received the Torah, and if the whole premise of this is that they somehow were given this mission to teach the world about Hashem, then how could it be that they have any chance of eventually playing that role if they have sunken to some kind of worse state of moral degradation? Like, how do you come back from that? That's one way of posing it. And also, I think, you could say there's something that immediately makes it less relevant to us in the present day if the way that you look at it is, well, they were murderers and they were thieves and they were doing obviously horrific things. They were getting carried around in sedan chairs while some destitute slave was being whipped in front of them to, carry them around. Like, you imagine brazen wickedness and cruelty just being the norm, and you'd say, well, that's not the society that I live in. So, back then, humanity in general was in a much more degraded moral state. And so back then this was an issue, but probably not something to worry about too much today. And then suddenly it kind of seems, less relevant. And so, you could say to sort of correct that or modify it, well, maybe actually the resolution of those two things is that it really wasn't that bad, or at least, let's say, by the standards of humanity at the time, where there was, rampant slavery and murder everywhere. It was probably better than maybe some adjacent society like Egypt or Canaanite society or what have you. But in order to make his point, the Navi is using hyperboles. He's saying, oh, you're just as bad as Sodom, and you may as well be murderers. You may as well be thieves for how sort of corrupt you are. And so then it's kind of a relative thing where it's saying, look, the standard you have to meet is you're Hashem's people, and you're way below the standard that you have to meet. And so we're going to talk about you like you're thieves and murderers and say you haven't measured up, you haven't done well enough, so the temple's going to be destroyed. And that resolves for us the issue of how could this people, on the one hand, be this kind of unique nation of priests that has this role to teach humanity about Hashem, and yet at the same time, they're Sodom, they're the most wicked society in the world that has to be destroyed by Hashem. And then we don't need to resort to the idea as much that, oh, well, back then things were awful. And it starts to become relevant more so to our present day, in the sense that if this was always kind of a relative standard, then, maybe we don't get a free pass today by getting to say, well, look, I'm not sort of cackling with glee as I steal a poor man's last loaf of bread, and I'm not having, people whipped in front of me to make me richer, or something like that. All these sort of horrors that you might imagine at the remove of thousands of years. You no longer can separate yourself as much from the language of the Navi, because now we're saying, oh, well, really, that was hyperbole. Really, it was kind of relative. And that means that it could also apply to you today. You could also be this murderer, this thief, this totally corrupt kind of person, or a society of such people in the present day, according to the Navi, because maybe Hashem still feels like you haven't measured up and you could do better. And so you too are stoned, because there's always kind of a way to improve. But that in its own way produces another problem, because when you start talking that way, on the one hand, there's something proper about saying one can always improve and one society can always do better, and you always should worry about the ways in which kind of corruption and oppression are being hidden from view but are still there, and you should be concerned about that. And there's an authentically Judaic way of having that concern on the one hand, and on the other, at a certain point, it becomes cynical and nihilistic and Marxist in this way, where it's a methodology for justifying the destruction of any society, right? Because all societies are made of people who are flawed and imperfect, and they all have people in them who end up having worse experiences. And when you zoom out and look at the system as a whole, there's always a way of pointing at the people who seem to be the losers at a given moment in terms of, I don't know, their material well-being or their political outcomes or whatever else, the things that are happening to them that are bad, that they don't like. And you can sort of say, you are the innocent victim that this whole society is kind of designed to suck the blood of and prey upon. And that means that although there are parts of the society where if we just focus the camera over here, it looks like things are nice and people are behaving well, it's all, founded on rot, and founded on corruption, and founded on exploitation, and founded on injustice and cruelty and oppression, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore it doesn't deserve to exist. It doesn't deserve to stand. It has to be brought down. That is cynically, in the hands of Marxist revolutionary types, always the argument, right? And at some level, that argument never can be wrong, because there's always a way of painting a picture like that. And so that, from the other direction, starts to also maybe be troublesome about the way the Hebrew prophets talk. Like, going back to try to sort of sharpen the point now that we've laid out these different options, it's like, okay, Yeshayahu or Amos or any one of, Hosea, pick your, book from the Nevi'im in the Hebrew Bible. There are very similar themes across many of these different Nevi'im, that they look at Israelite society and they say, I see oppression of the weak and exploitation of the weak. I see corruption, people taking bribes, people stealing from or cheating each other, people murdering, all the different kinds of wickedness and injustice. And in such a society, there is no value to religious ritual. The temple has no purpose if people are going to deal unjustly with each other in this society that's supposed to be dedicated to teaching the world about Hashem by example. And so, the temple will be destroyed, people will be thrown into exile, et cetera, right? That message over and over and over again, you hear some version of from different Nevi'im. So when the prophetic voice speaks about the Israelite society, and this is what it says, we, looking from our remove, either can look at it and say, well, that was then. Lots of people were murderers then. It's much less common now. We're doing much better. So that was a relevant excoriation for nearly 3,000 years ago, or for, let's say, 2,500 years ago. But it's less relevant now. So it's kind of interesting to learn the history of the Jewish people by studying this. But, I don't need it today. That's one kind of problem. And on the other hand, you go to the other extreme and you say, how can any society kind of avoid such condemnation if we start to view it always in the relative terms of it could always be better, and there's always some oppression going on somewhere, or some person that can raise their hand and say they feel kind of like they're being exploited by the system, and that can become the basis for an argument for saying this whole society has no justification to exist because there are losers in this game. There are people who can claim that the system is not working for them, and therefore Hashem still, is unsatisfied and still, ultimately he looks at this society and he sees Sodom again and again. It merits his wrath. That when you go to that extreme, it both feels like an overly harsh application, even if sincere, of a authentically Judaic way of reading the text, or it very quickly becomes a cynical tool for people who have no interest in Torah, but do have an interest in the kind of conspiracy theory of injustice argument for why society has to be torn down that becomes the basis for Marxist type arguments for revolution and upheaval, right? That there at some level is power to be had by selling to the mob the idea that the whole society has lost its right to stand, has lost its right to exist. And at some level, it's not accidental that a lot of really nasty, hardcore revolutionary leftists have either been Jews estranged from Torah, or certainly have been rubbing elbows with them, because there is a prophetic voice that's very attractive, a quote unquote prophetic voice that's very attractive to the hard left, that can look at any society and say, look, you don't meet some impossible standard of perfect justice. Look, I see this one guy over there who's being ground into the dust by the system, so burn it all down, and then we'll try what's behind door number 2, right? So where are we supposed to situate ourselves in that, between these extremes? How do we pick up Yeshayahu or Amos and read them and say, this still has something to teach me about the present day, but I'm not going to read it and then say, oh, what's the point? We failed again. Put a torch to the whole thing. There's no point to it, right? How can you have some sense of doing better if it always is possible with a prophetic voice to say, oh, you're all a bunch of murderers and thieves. What does Hashem want from your offerings when you still just can't manage to have a society without exploitation? So that's a way of posing the question, and I think the answer does lie in the way that Yeshayahu kicks things off, and in a way that repeats itself in the language of other Nevi'im, because really it's all kind of cribbing to some degree from Parshat Ha'azinu, which is another place and really a kind of paradigmatic place where the Torah raises the idea of the destruction of societies as always having to do with sort of resemblance to Sodom, resemblance to stone. That Yeshayahu starts off his argument by bringing up Sodom. Other Nevi'im also bring up Sodom. So it helps to go back to Sodom. The Sodom is the proof text, or the sort of the source in the Torah itself that's going to help us to grapple with this issue. The story with Sodom, again, is that Lot, the nephew of Avraham, looks towards Sodom and sees that it is well watered. Kula mashke kegan Adonai ke'eretz Mitzrayim. Right? It looks like it is well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. He sees Sodom and he sees a prosperous society, and he moves there. And then when we encounter him there later, we find that he's receiving guests in his home, and all the people of the city gather on the house to demand that the guests be thrown out to them. He tries to protect his guests. Ultimately, then destruction comes to the city. He and his daughters escape to the mountains and engage in incest in the mountains. And I think there's obviously always a lot of different things you can look at in any given piece of the Torah. But here, for our purpose in Sodom, I think the relevant thing is Avram's argument with HaKadosh Baruch Hu about how many righteous people need to be in Sodom in order for it to be spared Hashem's wrath, and also the fact that Sodom represents seemingly this extreme of collectivization of moral responsibility into a polity. Because it's not just some people in Sodom that gather on Lot's house. It's everyone. The text is very explicit. Everyone, great and small, young and old, right? Like everyone in the city. It sort of repeats itself multiple times. And that's significant because it doesn't locate things as a kind of a matter of individual choice, but more like it's identifying the city of Sodom as a unified political collective. Terem yishkavu wa anshe ha'ir anshe Sodom nasavu al habayit minar ve'ad zaken kol ha'am mikatze. So, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all people from every quarter. Right? It's so repetitive and emphasizes that so much. And so there's some sense in which part of the reason that Sodom is destroyed in the way that it is because there's something where it's like everyone has sort of contractually collectivized their responsibility together. And so they're on one ship that either will float or sink. And Lot, is the tzaddik, let's say, although obviously you can question some of Lot's behavior, but for our purposes here, let's imagine, since Lot comes from Avram, that Lot is kind of the tzaddik that's there. And he ultimately is saved with his daughters. So there is still some sense where Hashem can kind of go to the individual level and assess responsibility. But the city as a whole is destroyed for reasons that seem somehow connected with the fact that we're not getting people to have separate judgment here. So, Avram, when he goes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, "Oh, Halil alecha," God forbid, so to speak, that you would destroy the righteous with the wicked, he's asking exactly the question of, can you decide that a city as a whole is to be destroyed, or do you have to decide on the basis of the behavior of individuals, who's righteous and who is not? And what's interesting is when he has this bargaining session with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he starts with, what if there are 50 tzaddikim? 50 is an interesting number because even the Torah itself often counts people in hundreds. And so 50 is half of 100. And obviously, in the present day, we easily recognize 50 as 50%. It's half. And so he starts with the idea of like, well, what if 50% are tzaddikim? In other words, what if it's only barely a majority of people who are wicked in the city? Then you're going to just get rid of all the righteous people there because they're slightly less numerous than the wicked in the city. That seems not fair. It's a city with lots of righteous people then. And he keeps going down 50, down to 10, in steps. But then he doesn't go below 10. And I think the point is, if you do think of it as percentages, then at a certain point, the argument does shift, because it becomes difficult to talk about what it means to be a righteous person if you're in a society that is 99% wicked, right? How do you act like a righteous person when 99% of the people around you are acting wickedly? Like, if they're stealing all the time and they're murdering all the time, then just in order to survive, maybe you have to take property from people and kill people. And maybe you're slightly more thoughtful somehow about like when what you're doing is justified. But at the end of the day, it's going to get very gray as to whether or not you're a thief or a murderer, if you're just doing what you need to get along in a world where everyone else is a thief and a murderer. So there's something not separable to the individual level at the end of the day about righteousness. And the Torah is identifying that to some degree, that it's not really entirely possible to judge people separately. You do have to kind of judge people to some degree as all in the same boat when they're part of a society. And there's a lot in halacha and statements by Chazal that reflect this, where if you go live among Rishaim, then it's like you're choosing to do avodah zarah, al titchaber l'rasha, like don't consort with or befriend the wicked. That there's some notion of you have a responsibility not just to be righteous, but to choose to be among righteous people, because those are not actually separable things. You can't just say, I'm going to be righteous and I'm going to go live with the worst people in the world. See how well you can manage to behave if you're surrounded by criminals and corrupt people. So at some level, then when we look at Sodom, we can see that the story is partly showing that to us by saying, look, Lot, however well-intentioned he might have been, if he's the only righteous person in this whole city, then his righteousness ends up not being worth very much. The city can't be saved for his sake. He can't have an impact on what happens in the city. He's just one guy. He can't transform it. And then it's interesting because he himself, maybe in his own life, goes to the other extreme. Like he gets out of Sodom, and then he perhaps takes the lesson too sharply in another direction, where he escapes and goes to kind of a smaller place called Zoar. But then he says, Hine na matzah avdecha hein ba'inecha v'tagdel hasdecha asher asita imadi lahayot et nafshi v'anochi lo uchal lehimalet hahara pen tidbakani hara'a wamati. So behold, now your servant has found grace in your sight, and you've magnified your mercy, which you have shown to me in saving my life. I cannot escape to the mountain, lest some evil take me and I die. Hine na ha'ir hazot krova lanus shama, wahi mitza'ar imalata na shama halo mitza'ar hi uthi nafshi. Behold, now this city is near to flee to, and it is a little one. Oh, let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall survive. And it's interesting, this idea of it being either little or young. Tsa'ar, tsa'ir, it means young, which will actually appear shortly later in the passage, literally to mean young. That maybe it's small, maybe it's little. He's sort of saying, maybe I can try this in like a smaller society. Like maybe I'll have more of an impact in a smaller society. But then ultimately, what happens as you go further on is that it says, "V'ya'al Lot mitzoar v'yeshev bahar u'shtei benotav imo ki yarei lashevet betzoar v'yeshev me'ara hu u'shtei benotav." Ultimately, he ends up, all right, and Lot went out of Zoar and lived in the mountain, and his two daughters with him, for he feared to live in Zoar. and he lived in a cave, he and his two daughters. It doesn't say why he fears to live in Zohar, but you can surmise perhaps that he thinks it's the same problem that happened in Sodom might happen in Zohar, like that he's not successful in doing what he's trying to do in Zohar either. And if he's like, I'm still just one man, I can't change this society either, even though it's smaller or younger or however you want to look at it. And then he's just with his daughters in a cave. And that's the other extreme, right? Where he's withdrawing from being part of a society. He's just saying, look, just be me and my daughters in a cave. And that becomes obviously perverse, right? Because it ends in incest. There's no success associated with Lot's ultimate move to withdraw from society completely, but he's driven to that extreme because he's grappling with this issue of, how do I, as an individual, behave as a member of a society? And that, I think, is the problem in its essence that we're raising, that we were bringing up actually with Yeshayahu before, and with all of these different Nevi'im, these prophets, because the point is that the individual has a choice to make about how to act, but the individual can't single-handedly transform everything about the society that he's a part of. And that was true even thousands of years ago, and all the more so now in a very globally connected world. And so when you analyze the behavior of any individual, and then you start to say, what is the correct way for you to behave, and how should your actions be judged? And more generally, what is the quality of this society, when we zoom out, and how should it as a whole be judged? The general problem that you run into for Lot and for anyone in any society is, how do you count on the scale for the judgment of the fate of an individual, all the different things that are happening in the society that an individual is choosing to be a part of. And it both seems unfair to say that the individual is responsible for all the worst things that are happening, beyond his view and indirectly connected to him, right? He goes out to the market and he buys things in the market, and he doesn't even know all the people that he's buying things from necessarily. And he can't know every single action that was taken by another person to produce the scene that he's now becoming a part of. So someone could always come along and be like, oh, you went and you bought a piece of fruit in the market, but did you know that actually in order to get that fruit to the market, someone else had to be whipped or murdered, and that happened off camera? And it's impossible actually to thrive and survive in the world if you paralyze yourself with every single transaction I engage in, or every single exchange I engage in with a person, I have to know all the ripple effects and all of the second and third order connections, all the degrees of freedom. And until I do, I don't know what is morally pure and what isn't. Right? That's paralyzing. It's impossible to actually exist that way. And in fact, when some people try to live that way, in the modern era, they end up doing arbitrary and, let's say, symbolic actions to make themselves feel like they're showing that kind of concern, but they really can't show that concern comprehensively because they need too many different kinds of transactions to survive. So you can't exist without buying into a society and without, to some degree, entangling yourself with the choices of many others and taking some responsibility for the society as a whole, and not just saying, oh, I'm an individual, just judge me, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you are not um, equally involved in everything that's going on. And it wouldn't be fair to say, okay, you've plugged into society. You had no choice. You needed to survive. You became part of society. And now that you're part of society, you just have to go down with the ship if the society has some people in it who are wicked. And it turns out that you actually bought your groceries from someone who had his car fixed by someone who was wicked last week. And now you're part of the problem, right? So Avram, viewed in this light, and certainly now, once you look through the story of Lot and then go back to this argument that Avram is having, at some level, Avram is maybe having a more sophisticated discussion at some level with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? On its face, it seems like Avram is just saying, I'm worried about individuals who are righteous, getting a bad shake. But when he says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat," it's shall the judge of the earth not do justice? Is usually how it's translated. It sounds like a rhetorical statement where he's kind of trying to guilt trip or accuse HaKadosh Baruch Hu of not dealing justly because maybe a tzaddik will have a bad outcome because he's living in Sodom, and that seems unfair. But you could also say it's a direct statement. Hashofet kol haaretz, hashofet kol haaretz, lo yaseh mishpat. That if a judge tries to judge all the world at once, there's no such thing. There's no possibility of doing justice because there is something there's a contradiction in terms. It's not ever fair or possible to judge a society as a whole because at some level justice is more suited to looking at the actions of individuals situated within the context in which they exist. Right, they're dealing with whatever circumstances they're dealing with and trying to do the best they can and trying to keep the law, etc. So I think that that poses the problem for us fairly well. And interestingly, I think the resolution of it that is suggested comes back to something that has come up, I think, in many shiurim before, which is that ultimately David, Hamelech HaMashiach, the Davidic line of kings for Yehudah, and the Israelite nation comes from Lot, right? Lot, through his incestuous relationship with one of his daughters, produces Moav. Moav becomes the nation that produces Ruth, who converts and joins the tribe of Judah, and then becomes the great-grandmother of David HaMelech. And so, in a very interesting way, what the text is showing us narratively is that Lot had the intention to be a righteous individual in whatever society he had to participate in. And there was something correct enough about that we want to preserve it. We don't just say Lot is garbage, forget about Lot. But at another level, there was also something naive and unsuccessful about what Lot did. Lot's project ultimately was a failure. He goes to Sodom, and he can't make Sodom a good place. And he ultimately ends up behaving badly because he is part of Sodom. But the other extreme that he goes to also has its day, where he goes into the cave with his daughters, and he's kind of realizing, any society that I become a part of, whether it's Sodom or Tzoar, there always is this problem of I'm becoming entangled with the potential wickedness of the society as a whole. And therefore, I want to opt out. I don't want to be a part of this. I want to have a clean bill of health, and the way that I can do that is by not being part of a society. But then obviously at that other extreme, you get this sort of perversion of there being no society, and the only thing that's left is what Lot does with his daughters, which is an abomination. And obviously there's, generalizations of that. It doesn't always have to be the sexual problem of incest. It's more generally, if you're just one person in a cave by yourself, you're just a hermit and a lunatic. At some level, being righteous involves being part of a society. And so you can't really be righteous by yourself. And so, but there's also, again, an acknowledgement of that desire of Lot to say, no, but I do want to be righteous. And so now forget society. I just want to be judged as an individual, because that's what's fair and that's what's needed in order for there at some level to be proper judgment. And so then at the end of the day, that is also a failure, but that failure produces Moab, which ultimately produces David. And then David is the one who is going to, found the place of the temple. So ultimately what David is he's going to be a king of a society where the whole question is, how do you create a society whose whole political system and economic system is directed in such a way as to try to rise above the problem that Lot encounters in Sodom, or the general problem of societies becoming wicked and people being unable to avoid being tangled up in the wickedness of other people in their society. And the solution of that is supposed to be a society based on Torah and a society with a temple, which is in particular is kind of meant to be a sort of anchor for the economy of the society that connects the economy of the society to Hashem. And clearly that also at some level fails, at least in the sense that the first temple, the second temple, they weren't able to create this eternal perpetuity of righteousness for all the people in the society. And maybe that's always too much to hope for. But the understanding of the Torah is that it's maybe an iterative process, it's a step-by-step process, and so there may still have been progress in the right direction there. And so that starts to point the way to the question we posed at the beginning, because you wouldn't want to think that you can never climb out of the pit of being part of Sodom, right? That no matter what generation you're in, the prophet will always point at your society and say, this too is Sodom. There's still exploitation. There's still wickedness. If you can never do better, then what's the point, right? So David, coming from Lot, does seem to suggest the understanding of the tradition is, and the sources is, that you can do better, that there is some sense of the possibility of progress, but it's difficult, and it's not something that succeeds the first time around. But that the resolution of this is meant to be that ultimately Torah as a basis for a society it intends to be the antidote for the problem that Lot's story and the general problem of Sodom presents for us. And that doesn't mean that, the Israelites or the Judahites or whoever get it right the first time or even the second time, but it does light the way to some ideal methodology. Like, how are you supposed to create a collective, a group of people who are not just a bunch of thieves and murderers? And maybe more subtly, how can an individual tell that is what his society is like, and how can he decide how to act in whatever society he's in without just feeling like Lot, who's a drop in the bucket and who can't make a difference? And the answer is supposed to be through Torah, because Torah is about creating, in a sense, a kind of a method for decision-making that, on the one hand, both focuses on the choices of the individual and the responsibilities of the individual to deal with what's in front of him, and on the other hand, has a long-term effect and a long-term goal of transforming the society as a whole to kind of expand the range of trust that is possible. So on the one hand, the Torah is, lo bashamayim hi, lo rechuka hi, that the Torah is not up in heaven. The Torah is not far away over the sea from you, which there are different ways of reading that, but I think one certainly should be that you cannot decide how Hashem wants you to act by worrying about stories that you could tell about things happening thousands of miles away that have nothing to do with you, that are very distant, 100th order ripple effects of what you're doing, right? So this is very relevant at some level to how people grapple with what it is to participate in an economy in the modern world, where you don't really know where the things you buy come from. And there may be a general kind of value in trying to buy things that are more local and come from people you know because of that. And there are serious concerns with exactly how all the microchips that you're using, or exactly how all the devices that you're using got created, and whether they involved slave labor in a distant land or things like that. And you should, on the one hand, have some kind of concern about that, right? And on the other hand, if you start having that concern about everything, you'll starve to death. You won't, you'll be forced back into the grinding poverty of pre-modern subsistence farming with no medicine and very little food. And there are other moral problems that arise pretty quickly when you're on the brink of extinction like that, which was Lot's point in the first place at some level, right? That maybe you need to go to Sodom where it's prosperous in order to get a toehold and teach people right and wrong, when they aren't so hungry that they'll bash your brains in for a crust of bread. So the choice before a modern about exactly what to partake of and exactly what to refuse on the basis of how local it is, again, maybe knowing where things come from in general gives you more kind of control and knowledge in a way that allows you to act with more responsibility, but there's a limit to how far you can take that. And part of what the Torah does is it says, look, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world. You let him worry about how the whole world is run, and you have what's in front of you, and it is good and right for you to show the most concern for that which is most immediately under your control and available to your observation. And yes, you can have some more distant concern for things that kind of go out in expanding circles beyond that. But there are, commandments to fulfill in the here and now. And maybe there's someone in need who is in front of you, and that is more important than whether or not you've been able to fully trace all the different economic transactions that led you to be able to buy bread to eat, and figured out whether there was any wrong done on the other side of the world when the grain was being bought or imported or exported or whatever. Maybe what you should be concerned with is, oh, look, here's a starving person in my neighborhood and I have bread and he doesn't, and I can share the bread with him. And maybe that's the right frame to put on things on the one hand. So it's, lo rechukahi, it's not far away from you what the Torah actually expects of you. You start with what's close to you. And yet, at the same time, there is also this idea of ki mitzion tetzeh Torah u'davar Adonai miYerushalayim, right? That Torah should emanate from a place. It should emanate from Eretz Yisrael. That it actually isn't so great to send Am Yisrael to be these sort of dispersed, scattered little pockets of Lot amidst the other societies of the world that are run according to the mores and gods of other societies. That the goal is to create a Judaic society. And part of the point and the benefit of that is that if you can create a society where there's enough commonality of commitment to Torah, then the basis of trust becomes much greater in terms of what you can expect from the behavior of others, because you know them and you know what their commitments are, right? That you have a rich basis on which to kind of test, what do I have in common with these other people that I'm encountering? Well, I talk to them and I find that they also know a lot about Torah and a lot about the details of how you act in this situation and how you act in that situation. And before you know it, there are a lot of things that you can know with more confidence without seeing them, because you have some idea of the other people that you're dealing with, right? Like if you live in a society with hundreds of millions of people spread over a whole continent like America, where any given person mostly is a stranger, then you know much less about what they will do or won't do in any given situation. And when your whole life is a chain of transactions amongst that set of people, you're exposed to a lot more radical uncertainty about exactly what you are entangled with or implicated, in as you go, further out. Like what's being done in your name, what's being done in order for you to get what you're requesting or purchasing, what have you, the political and the economic aspects. Whereas if you're in Eretz Yisrael, which is a small place that you actually can walk from one side of to the other, and you're there with other people who are showing their commitment to Torah in a variety of different ways externally, and sharing in public expressions of that, and doing things that are difficult for them, that make you see in a sense that this is a person who is committed to doing things that are difficult for himself for the sake of Hashem. And that makes me sort of trust that he also knows what the halacha would be in this other situation. You start to have a lot more confidence. It's sort of like, well, I don't know how you got this loaf of bread, but I don't think you murdered someone for it, right? Not that you're actually worrying that someone murdered someone else for a loaf of bread when you buy it in America, but I'm putting, again, things in extreme terms. The point is that there is it's not just a sense of locality, it's a sense of locality cross multiplied with high content signage about alignment of procedures for moral decision making. And the more that basis of trust can spread, the more you can know things without needing to see them, because you can trust that you're part of a society that is going to, in general, have higher trust or more trustworthy decision making about a variety of issues that could arise, right? So you buy something from this guy who bought it from this other guy who imported it from this other guy, and if that is an unbroken chain of tzaddikim, then you're less worried that at any point along the way that there was some kind of crime or exploitation that was necessary in order to provide you with what you're purchasing, or to get you, the thing that you're being given. And I think that there are really relevant present day examples to this, or the examples of this that come up, because again, I would say that the nastiest version of a kind of a perversion of the Hebrew prophetic voice is the Marxist or neo-Marxist society is evil, let's destroy it kind of way of talking, which is a common refrain in one version or another on the hard left, either in economic terms or in political terms. In economic terms, the idea is there always are people who have less. You can always point out that there are people who have less, and then you can claim the entire society is morally bankrupt because some people seem to be losing out economically. And in fact, in general, Marxist or hard left agendas seek to replace the society that they're criticizing with ones that are more oppressive. And so they don't necessarily offer an alternative that would reduce oppression, but they purport to call out oppression and take the side of the oppressed as a cynical means to calling for the destruction of society as we know it. And so you always have that kind of economic argument that someone's willing to make. But the grain of truth in it, the sort of voice of the Hebrew prophet, that it is fair for us to hear in it enough to at least be willing to ask ourselves, well, how do I know that this argument is bogus or doesn't make sense? Why shouldn't I listen to it? The grain of truth that's there is you should at some level be worried. Well, okay, I don't see myself robbing people every day. I don't see myself murdering people every day. But should I be worried that although I'm not doing those things, that the comforts that I enjoy or the success that I feel myself to enjoy in some way actually is somehow invisibly being sort of wrung from the suffering of others that are swept from view? And how can I be sure that my own society isn't just the same as the one that Yeshayahu excoriated, and it's just that it's more sort of inconspicuous somehow, but really I am also one of these corrupt murderers that these miratzchim that Yeshayahu is talking about. How can I be sure of that? And so it is, we can be sure at the outset that Marxists are, at the end of the day, nasty disruptors who just want to destroy society and replace it with repression. That is very clear from the lessons of the 20th century. But even if we know that to be true empirically and historically, it still is interesting to understand better how to give answer to them when they strike the pose of an Amos or of a Yeshayahu, because there's some very nasty Marxists and hard leftists who will literally say, "Oh, I love Amos. I love the prophetic voice of the Hebrew Bible. I'm all about that," because they'll twist it and they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's basically social critique of an economic kind, and now wouldn't you like some Marxist revolution?" But there's also the kind of the political version of this, which also you often get from the hard left, which it manifests when people want to denounce Israel, but also other societies where, and you see this in a certain genre of film also, but where it's about people who lead undisrupted, comfortable lives who don't realize that horrific crimes are being committed in their name in order to ensure the existence of the protected life that they enjoy, right? And that was especially a kind of a common refrain that was part of the kind of KGB-driven campaign of demoralization in the West during the Cold War, right? Where it's like you think you have a decent society at home, but really, you're committing war crimes in tropical jungles in order to ensure that existence. And I think without entering into it, and talking about the Cold War, because who wants to do that? There's another version of that is also very much a kind of a KGB spun line of attack that has become very common against Israel, and which also gets taken up by the hard left here in Israel, which again is like, you think this is a nice country, you like this about it or that about it, but it's all soaked in blood. It's all actually based on these horrific crimes that are being committed in your name that you're happy to have done, so long as they are shielded from your view, so you don't have to face it. But when you sit there drinking your coffee, your hand is soaked in blood, as Yeshayahu would put it. But then the accusation is being leveled in this way where the implication is the things that state of Israel has to do in order to ensure its own security are these horrific crimes. It's all horrific crimes that, in a sense, it's not that they in any regard are things that are necessary and good and right in order for the society to have a chance of existing, but more like they're unspeakable and unforgivable crimes that make it so the society clearly doesn't deserve to exist. Like that if it must, in order to exist, do these things, then that's unacceptable and therefore it cannot exist and it's illegitimate, right? That's the hard left argument against the state of Israel. And I think maybe like an Oscar was given to some self-hating Jew who made a movie about Auschwitz a few years ago that was kind of like by a metaphor trying to make a point like that. And the point is that all of these conspiracy theory kinds of moral frameworks, the way they all operate is just destructively. There's no presentation of a way things could work that would be right and would not be oppressive or would not be blood-soaked, but rather it just is about taking the best that people can come up with in terms of good, decent societies that thrive and survive, and then saying, sorry, but we've identified the hidden massacre or the hidden enslavement or whatever else that all of this has to be based on in order for it to function. And that is the sort of indelible mark, the original sin that can't be expunged. And so it all needs to be burned down and replaced. And so that's what haters of Israel say. That's what Marxists who want to destroy societies with functioning markets say. And you hear versions of that in the present day, and it is worth asking yourself, okay, how can I respond to that? What is the argument other than just to say, I know why you're saying this and I mistrust your motives. I know you really just hate Israel and want to destroy it, and you're not really so interested in equally holding all societies' feet to the fire in terms of how morally perfect they are. Or I know you really just want a Marxist oppression, and you're just trying to say anything to make people have less faith in the basis of their society or what have you. That again, those are fair reasons to reject and ignore this kind of argument. But if you take it, more seriously on its merits and say, like, how do I get beyond this view? Because it is it's a hard thing to answer, because the whole premise of the argument is that we're talking about things that you don't see, right? That it's all about being able to say, well, although you may say, well, you didn't murder anyone, and you didn't hold a lash over anyone who was slaving in front of you. So although it's the case, your hands are still soaked in blood, or you're still an oppressor, but it's all indirect and it's all invisible. How can you answer that? How can you respond to a claim that is premised on the notion that we're talking about things that are not really directly in your view? And I think the point is, again, now we're better positioned to think these through now that we talked about Stone, we've talked about David, we talked about Torah and how Torah means to function. What it comes down to, I can say very concretely, where I live, I can hear sometimes the distant sounds of explosions in Gaza, where they're fighting the war currently. And if you ask, if a sort of anti-war, burn society down hard leftist cynic comes along and says, oh, well, how can you sleep at night with the horrors that are being done in your name? You do have to think through, okay, well, what is my responsibility for what's being done? What's my connection to it? And how do I know what I'm hearing about it is the truth? And how do I know it's not propaganda to hide the truth from me? Right? Those are the questions of any individual in a polity all the time. And I think the point is, again, it comes back to the answer being, what do you have in common with the other people in the society that you're a part of? For some societies, the most that anyone can say is, well, what I have in common is we've all got a social security number, or we all believe in voting every 4 years. Or in some other society, it might be, what we have in common is we all really like this one kind of cheese, and we like to wear hats that are shaped like this. And those kinds of bases for commonality are very thin, and it pretty quickly just gets beyond you to know, like, what would someone else who's my countryman do in some variety of circumstances, and would I approve of that, and would it align with what I might consider just or right? And what we have, Baruch Hashem, in the Judaic society, and more so as time goes on, is a very rich basis for saying, oh, well, first of all, we're a small society. We're a very connected society. We all know each other, 2-3 degrees of separation, and you can get to almost anyone. And through those degrees of separation, you also encounter people who have studied a lot of the same texts and are really committed to a lot of the same practices in ways that demonstrate that this is not just a game for them, but that they believe Hashem is watching and that He is the judge. And when you add all that up, and then you sort of compare that situation to this sort of silly movie about, the whistleblower in the CIA who's revealing to everyone that actually their country is doing unspeakable evil in secret and blah, 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 which is, a dozen or like probably 100 movies at this point that Hollywood has made about the CIA or things like it. That by comparison, when you talk about it, in Israel, yeah, of course, there still can be things that this or that person will do that maybe you wouldn't sign up for, but you never actually can control or know all of those things. But what you can know is the collective that you're a part of, how high content is your relationship across those different degrees of separation to everyone, and how are they bound to you, and how you are both bound together before HaKadosh Baruch Hu via the Torah. And the more that becomes the case, the more that the Torah becomes the basis for that gluing together of society, the more that it becomes the case that there is a broad distribution of a lot of that content and commitment, the more you start to be able to trust me. You say, look, I wasn't there when, this or that thing happened, but I know who was there, or I know people who know who was there. I'm not so separate from them. I'm not so different from them. I have these things in common with them. And I trust them more than I trust some Marxist propagandist spinning a tale about some other thing that happened than what I heard, right? So there's a very subtle sense in which the story with Lot in Sodom, like when Sodom gets brought up by the prophets over and over again, it's not an accident. It's saying, go look at Sodom, go look at Lot in Sodom, and understand how the Davidic kingship and how the Torah become the antidote to the political problem of morality at a collective level that Sodom is really showing to you. And that's the way for us to look back and say, okay, maybe it is the case that, I don't know, a long time ago, in the time of Yeshayahu, people literally were murdering each other all the time in Jerusalem, and so fine, destroy the temple. But if I'm going to understand what's different today and why my society is not also slated for destruction, because Yeshayahu could also come along and say, well, your hands are soaked in blood too. The Torah is the methodology by which I can reach out and grab onto a society around me and tell that I'm a part of something that would do differently. And where I can do that without needing, or let's say without attempting the impossible, which is to gather information with this sort of eye, all-seeing eye above, to try to sort of track every transaction and vet it one by one, right? Like, as people arbitrarily and in quasi-religious ways try to do in the secular West now, where you say like, oh, well, I'm not going to buy chocolate unless it's fair trade. So I've decided when it comes to chocolate, I really care about transactions between farmers in third world countries and importers who buy cocoa beans or something. There's nothing terribly wrong with that on its face, but you're going to do that. But what about every single other thing that you buy? And how many things that you buy can you actually track in that way? And how completely are you tracking these things? You can drive yourself mad, or, even if you don't, you do something, and in terms of what it adds up to, it's like you're inventing a new version of keeping kosher, but it's much more arbitrary and of much more dubious basis in terms of the completeness of what it's attempting to accomplish. It's kind of a losing battle to try to be moral that way for a variety of reasons. But what you can be is you can be situated within a society where you have the opportunity to tell the kind of people that you're dealing with by talking to them, by knowing them, by being close to them, by being connected enough to them and the people that they're connected to, that the basis for trust that what's being done for your sake and in your name becomes much greater. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong with whatever is being done. There always are things to fix. But it does mean that you as an individual have a sensible methodology and posture that you can adopt for how to thrive and live in the world while that world is still imperfect, while the society you're a part of is still imperfect, and where you can say, I'm working on moving it in the right direction in the following way, and here's what it is. And it's about living according to the Torah and trying to spread that approach throughout the society.